Yeah. Awesome. So I know a lot of us, we kind of hear about the Vietnam War. That's like kind of a buzzword and everything. Today, the reason for not having phones or headphones is because a lot of times in classes, all you do is just like stare and take notes. And that's not necessarily what I want to do today. I want us to have an open discussion. I want people to feel free to raise their hands, to talk with one another, and kind of figure this out together and make it a little more interesting than just copying stuff down. So just kind of keep that in mind. Don't necessarily have to write a lot down, but just be present and understand as we go along. So real quick to start, we have what do you know about the Vietnam War? All right, this is just very basic. So maybe meet with just one or 2 or 3 people in a group real quick and spend about 3 or 4 minutes. I want you to see if you can come up with 3 things that you know. If you don't know very much, just come up with 1 or something. But take about 2 or 3 minutes and just maybe get in a group and write down 2 or 3 things, and then we're going to share that. Yeah, on paper, yeah. Or just talk about it as a group, and then we'll discuss it.
I didn't even know it was going to happen. I was just sitting there where I'm really sitting.
What do you think? What's on your mind? What have you
The Vietnam War, where do you think it's not World War II, Russia and us got to a fight.
Vietnam War was fun.
Russia.
Yeah, I hear that one a lot. That's a good starting point. That's very important.
He saved them with all their clothes. He saved them with all
Houston, what do you know about the Vietnam War?
I really don't know Vietnam.
Yeah?
Why we went there, what was the purpose of it, that kind of thing. All right, good deal. Thank you for talking about that, being in groups. Even if you don't know that much, it's important to kind of have a discussion. So what we're going to do is we're just going to start with very basic things about the war. Well, let me do this. Like, maybe give me 1 or 2 things, right? What did y'all talk about in your groups? Like, what did you guys talk about, or you guys?
We got involved in
Something you come up with. Sorry, go ahead.
We got involved in 1954.
Yeah, very good. Awesome. Any other things floating around? I think one I heard was that it was fought in Vietnam. That's very observant. So good job there. Anything else? There's a few things on. Go ahead. Right. Yeah. So that was a manner that the North Vietnamese used, the guerrilla tactics. They had traps and all that kind of stuff. Very good. Anything else? Helicopters, yeah, they were widely used. That was a tactic, is that they would constantly circulate. I forget the name of the actual helicopter, but the type of helicopter it is. But they would come and drop troops off and then fly away, and that's how they would kind of keep troops and supply that. Awesome, very good. Thank you guys for talking. That's a lot of good things to come up with. So this is some of the background, or just some of the overall information. Right, someone mentioned 1954 or 1955, it's a little bit debated, but is the longest war in American history. I mean, 20 years you're there in a country, and if you think about it, it's like, how do you even have a goal for 20 years? Like, what are you trying to do? And so that's why a lot of stuff gets contested, a lot of different tactics or intentions of the U.S. government always get tested. Costs over $200 billion. You're fighting a war. There's supporting South Vietnamese forces and also sending over tons and tons of military equipment. Almost 60,000 Americans died over the course of the 15 to 20 years that they were there. And this war was one of the first wars to really be heavily protested directly by the public. So we're gonna watch this video, and I want you just to observe what's going on, who's doing what does it look like, what's the environment, and then we're gonna talk about a few of those things. Nope. Try that again.
19 is commuting to war. 21 GIs bound for a jungle clearing a mile from the Cambodian border. American soldiers hiking their way through the sweaty jungles of South Vietnam, searching for an elusive enemy. The temperature is almost 100 degrees, and the jungle stifles even the tiniest breeze. The going is slow. There could be a North Vietnamese regiment hiding a few yards away, and no one would see it. Nobody talks, so you start thinking. Specialist Corps Dwayne Boer is thinking he's going to meet his fiancée in Honolulu in 2 weeks, and he will show her the silver star the general pinned on him yesterday. DeValle is the lone medic in the platoon. He's scared from the moment he gets out of the chopper to the moment it picks him up. Scared that someday he's going to get killed picking up a wounded buddy. Jorgensen just became a sergeant, but he doesn't like it. He'd rather be up walking point, where the action is. He's already got 3 Purple Hearts, so everybody calls him Hero. Then there's Lieutenant Hughley. Everybody calls him Blue. That's his radio call. Blue didn't want to come to Vietnam, and he'd much rather be a businessman than a soldier. But right now, he's in charge of the lives of 21 men. Somewhere in this jungle, there's several hundred North Vietnamese soldiers who could wipe out this little American unit to the last man in an unguarded moment. Today, though, it's quiet. A few bunkers uncovered, then a quick lunch, and back down the trail to the pickup zone. Just a peaceful walk in the sun.
Okay, would you roll in a 270 from the smoke, approximately 100 meters away from it now, just from there.
All right, what's one there? All right, give me some cover.
Give me some cover.
Get him back here if you can. Can you move him? Can you move him? Okay, try to bring him back here. Remember to stop the bleeding.
And DeValle, the medic, having survived another rescue mission, brings back the wounded man. Who is it? Who is it? The question spreads down the line.
All right, so we'll stop there. And go back to present.
It might pop up the thing at the bottom, maybe.
Okay.
There you go.
Go back to over here.
That one, yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so right, that's a video filmed right in the middle of it, right in the action. What are your thoughts? Like, if you think about, I mean, this is pretty incredible. Like, imagine going to a country you've never heard of, and then all of a sudden you're in this jungle fighting, right? And we kind of get a sense of that from the video. And the point of that is just to think about what it would be like, right? Because war often seems like we hear about it in history class, right? We say, oh, World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, and it kind of just becomes this thing you constantly hear, but we don't ever think about, right? Like what it was actually like. Because, and we'll get into this more, but I mean, the average age of people here was 20 or 21 years old, right? I'm 21. 8 people that were 18 were being drafted, and not like a year or 2 years, right? You guys are 17, right? Is anybody 18 yet? Senior, right? So, being that age, being in the middle of a war, it's kind of mind-boggling. It's really hard to get a sense of it. So, as I mentioned previously, this was the first war that was widely protested. It's not like everybody was for the war necessarily in World War II, but there was a huge movement created that sought to influence the government to either get out of Vietnam, bring the troops home. and that sort of thing. So real quick, we'll watch this video, but I have some reasons here, but why would you be opposed to the war? What would be your reasoning there? Because often we're like, oh, America, we're going to go help people, but why would you be against that? If you're a college student or you're this and that, what would lead to that?
What are you asking? Are you asking?
Sorry, like what, we're gonna watch this video, but what do you think is a reason that people would be against the war?
Oh, people don't want to die.
Rural, yeah, right?
That's pretty.
Anything else? Yeah, go ahead. Do what? Go ahead, sorry. Right, the economy, obviously it's very expensive, right, to go to war. Anything else come to mind? Yeah.
At this time, nobody wanted to fight it, wanted peace.
Right. So I mean, we had been World War II, Korean War. You know, why are we getting into another conflict that's 1,000 miles away or more from where the United States is, right? So things I have here, this video is short, we're gonna watch it, but, or we'll watch it real quick and then we'll kind of go over some of these reasons. This one's nice and short, so.
Thousands of demonstrators opposed to the Vietnam War assembled in the nation's capital for a mass protest. For the most part orderly, minor scuffles did occur between the demonstrators and hecklers. A 3-hour parade takes the demonstrators across the Potomac on their way to the Pentagon. The crowd, estimated at about 50,000 persons, was a loose confederation of some 150 groups and included adults, students, even children. It is at the Pentagon where the first test of strength comes. Military police contain the crowd, but clashes soon break out. Federal marshals arrest several who attempt to break through the protective line. Reinforcing the marshals, a second wave of MPs with fixed bayonets in scabbards move into position. Some 400 demonstrators are arrested, 2 soldiers are injured, and tear gas is used. 6 break into a Pentagon side door, but are quickly apprehended in the day-long disturbance. The next day, campfires are lighted to hold off the autumn chill. The same weekend saw nationwide demonstrations supporting American GIs in Vietnam. The Pentagon protest was less violent in its second day of sitting in. The 2-day protest ends with over 600 arrested and the widespread opinion that the demonstration made everyone a loser.
So they just sat there and protested at the Pentagon?
Yeah, it was, has anyone seen Forrest Gump?
We're very excited to announce that today's video is sponsored by Audible.
That's one of my favorite movies. Who's seen that? Right? Anybody? Yeah? There's a scene where he had fought in Vietnam and he comes back and they ask him to give his opinion about the Vietnam War, and that lady unplugs all the stuff so he can't share his experience. She's against the war. Anyway, so that was a movie, but in real life, how that happened. There's a march in Washington. Right there, you saw the march in the Pentagon. So a few reasons here is people couldn't understand why we were fighting, right? It seemed as though we were fighting an unwinnable war. You're sending young men to die in a place, this is your thought, is you're just going over there to die, which a lot of people did, you're sending them in a place they have never even heard of. Like, it's not like, oh, we're going to Europe and this is a clear goal to overcome, right, Nazi forces. It's like, no, we're just going over there to kill people that seem to be engaged in a civil war. So right here I said, there's no clear enemy to rally against, right? So if you remember studying World War II, right, you had, okay, like the Nazis, right, like that's an evil thing, like it makes sense to go against that. Where this was more of like an ideological discussion, right? So meaning the reason is we're trying to fight communism, but it's not very direct. So one thing I mentioned here as a development of the credibility gap is that as this war is taking place, and as you saw in the video with the protests, people begin to lose trust in the government. Throughout World War I, World War II, there was like this sense that the government was doing their best to continue war efforts that were necessary. But people are struggling more and more to believe in the government, right? And a little much to get into, but over the course of this war, there was misinformation. It was the first war that was widely shown on TV, so people were getting a sense of the action. Awesome, very cool. So so here we go. How does this compare to World War II, right? That's kind of what I was mentioning. Like, there was a lot of support on the home front. There wasn't very many protesters on a wide scale because World War II was seen as, like, of course being attacked, right? Pearl Harbor. Not trying to get off track into all that, but there was a more defined enemy, right? Hitler. Hitler is the enemy. We're going to go against him because he is committing atrocities and evils and has taken over territory. But anyway, the point here is to kind of see the differential, and as that video showed, people were very passionate about it. They were willing to be arrested. Some of them fought police officers, and yeah, awesome. So let's move on. Let's see. Okay. So, has anybody here ever heard the term historiography? Historiography. Anybody ever heard that term? I didn't think so. I'd never heard about it either. This is sort of an offshoot of all this, right? Because I think I could give you facts and all this stuff about Vietnam all day. But let's see. Actually, I'm going to go in a different order. So historiography, right? Like I said, you may not have heard of it. I never heard about it when I was in high school. But when I did in college, it really kind of invigorated history for me as opposed to just memorizing dates. Historiography is how historians view history and how those interpretations change over time. So I'm going to try not to get too far into it, but how a historical thing is viewed over time changes, right? So for the longest time, this is an orthodox perspective, or historians had this viewpoint that the war should have never happened, it wasn't winnable, the U.S. shouldn't have got involved, there was no reason to send people off, there was no real understanding. And this view was the view that was kind of regurgitated for many, many, many years through the same kind of universities. And then earlier, or kind of later on, 90s and into 2000, you have a revisionist perspective, which did believe the war was necessary, and it was necessary because of, the fear of communism. And the U.S. had no choice to intervene, but because of some of the things the U.S. decided to do, the war was eventually lost. So I know a lot of that's kind of abstract and kind of you've never heard about it before. But the question is, how do these perspectives affect how we understand the war? How do they impact the government today? So some thoughts regarding that is depending on which perspective you're looking at in history, that's going to change your perception about the government. If you think the government shouldn't have got involved, then you're going to kind of lack trust in that. Or if you think, okay, we had to get involved because of the spread of communism, that's something different. So that's just sort of an introduction into that. That's just to let you know that there's more than just one perspective in history, because often we get taught, like, this is the fact, this is what people thought about. And so it's important to understand that that's not always the case. Stay with me. If you got your head down, try to sit up and stay with me. We're not going to be doing this too much longer. So in regarding the last thing, huge contention. I know Ms. Taylor was telling me that y'all had gone over Go Din Diem, that's hard to pronounce, and Ho Chi Minh. So was this guy right here, this is Diem, he was the leader of South Vietnam and ended up being overthrown by the U.S. government. Now, the reason it's interesting is because throughout history you see the U.S. backing efforts to overthrow certain leaders, and he was not a nice dude. He had people imprisoned, he had a bunch of his family members involved in the office, and he had a lot of people executed. So it's not like he's winning a popularity contest, but the reason that this decision of the U.S. to overthrow him gets debated is because him being taken out, him being taken out, destabilized South Vietnam. Because even though he kind of ruled with an iron fist, there was still direction in the government. So that's a point of contention, right, among those scholars. We have Ho Chi Minh, right? He was this leader, and often he is viewed as like, oh, this guy's a communist, like through and through, which is what his government became. But if you look at his history, he studied in London and came to the United States. So he kind of viewed himself as more of a nationalist than somebody who was strictly going for communism. And as we go through this, right, a common thread here is the domino theory. What's that? Anybody tell me? What's domino theory? Anybody tell me? What do you think? Dominoes? Go ahead.
When action causes a chain reaction of everything.
Right. So what was the fear? What was the chain? What was it?
If one country fell to communism, then its neighbors moved to.
Right. Exactly. Awesome. Thank you. So, right, that's the idea. I have this picture here. Right. Vietnam is the first domino. Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, India, Bangladesh. Right. So here we have this is the Viet Cong, right? That was the North Vietnamese forces was the Viet Cong, and yeah. So that's a concern. That's a thread that you see throughout the Cold War is containing communism. So basically, the point of this slide, right, is to understand some of the perspectives that people have different views on. Was Ho Chi Minh just some evil communist, or was he somebody who was right? So, okay, definitely. So people have that viewpoint, right? Yes, totally. But there's also a viewpoint that's like, oh, well, he was just a nationalist trying to build up a country, or they were fighting to be independent from Japan and from France. So, anyway, let's move on. Kind of getting towards the end here. Thank you guys so much for your participation and points. Thank you for raising your hand and answering things. So, what are the results of Vietnam? So, there was that consensus that before 1975 that there were peace accords that the countries agreed not to fight, but American aid. I'm going to show this video for about 2 minutes. American aid was taken out, but basically by 1975, the war had been lost in the sense that the North Vietnamese forces had taken over South Vietnam, and we're going to see this video that talks about Saigon, which was the basically the capital in South Vietnam, and basically it was eventually united under communist rule. So the whole point of being involved in Vietnam was sort of, it was shot. It was because it became communist, their goal was not reached, right? And then we talked about that earlier. People lost faith in the U.S. government. So this will be the last video, and this sort of just gives.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute.
By the time Gerald Ford assumes the presidency in August of 1974, U.S. aid to South Vietnam has been cut by 75% since its height a year earlier. For the ARVN, who've depended upon American money and military supplies since 1954, the cutbacks have a devastating effect. Planes sit idle on runways, unable to take off because of lack of fuel. Artillery pieces that had once been allocated 100 rounds per day are rationed to only 10. But while the ARVN's supplies are dwindling, the North Vietnamese are rebuilding their military strength. On March 10th, 1975, just over 2 years after the Paris Peace Agreement was signed, hopes for an independent South Vietnam come crumbling down. The North Vietnamese launched their largest and most ambitious offensive yet into the South.
ARVN units begin to falter. Hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese civilians run for their lives. On April 21st, President Thieu resigns. 4 days later, NVA forces reach the outskirts of Saigon. On April 29th, as Saigon crumbles, a small contingent of U.S. State Department, CIA workers, and Marines who remained in Vietnam begin a hasty and desperate evacuation of South Vietnamese civilians and government employees who had worked with the United States.
All right, that was the last video. So although the war had ended, right, the efforts of the United States, like I mentioned, the whole point in being involved in Vietnam was to prevent communism, but because of the U.S. stopped supporting, long story, with Gerald Ford, he came in, he begged them, right, in that video we saw, to get aid back to South Vietnam, but eventually it fell, right, and it was united under communist rule. So some of the takeaways, right, from this lesson, I know it can be a lot, it can be overwhelming, is to really try and consider our understanding of war and of what we think it is. Like I mentioned earlier, it can be something that we just hear all the time. We don't actually think about it, and luckily we don't have to live it out, right? We're not fighting right here, but it's still important to understand. And so real quick, as we finish up, I would like you to think about this question: what is the most surprising thing or the most interesting thing that you've learned about the Vietnam War? It doesn't have to be from today, just in general. So if anybody has any responses, go ahead.
With all the troops that didn't have that many troops.
Right. Yeah. It was a lot. It was a lot.
And I didn't know it was that long either.
I know. Yeah. Neither did I when I began to study the Vietnam War. Did a paper about that. I was like, I can't believe that this existed for so long, in 20 years, right? So anything else? Give me 3 or 4 more responses. I know we're probably tired.
I heard someone mentioned earlier about the traps.
Right? Yeah. That was you, right? I don't.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Yeah, you talked about the traps. The style. Well, that's something I didn't get to all the way. The style of warfare was crazy. It was just in a jungle. Go ahead. Oh, okay. Just stretch it. All right. Well, anyway, guys, I'm going to end it there. Thank you so much for your time, for paying attention, and I really appreciate it. So, thank you, guys. Woo. Yes.